Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 6, Episode 33. Today we're delving into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History. We're going to explore those really tumultuous post-war decades. When Britain was grappling with its diminishing global power and trying to find a new identity. You've asked us to take a deep dive into this fascinating period after 1945. Britain emerges from World War II, but faces this stark reality, a totally changed global landscape. So our mission today is to unpack how British government, how they navigated this new world and the huge challenges they faced, shifting alliances, internal economic pressures, all of it.
Yeah, and what's really compelling here, I think, is how the sources show a nation really struggling to reconcile its imperial past, that grandeur, with a new, much more constrained reality. We'll synthesize the key events, the big decisions that shape Britain's path, and look at how different leaders, Labour, Conservative, how they responded to these, immense shifts.
Okay, let's start with Britain's post-war reality. Some historians even call it the Grand Illusion. The sources make it pretty clear. Those 20 years after the war saw Britain standing just as slide, often described as declining to maybe a second or perhaps third-rate power next to the U.S. and the USSR. But British governments, both Labour and Conservative, they seemed almost unwilling to accept this, showing what historians call delusions of grandeur.
That's exactly right. I mean, think about it. 1946, the British Empire was still mostly intact on paper. Troops stationed all over the world, Germany, Greece, India, Palestine, Malaya. It was incredibly expensive, especially for a country whose resources were already, stretched so thin by the war. So it raises this really critical question for the leadership back then. How long could Britain actually afford this kind of global presence?
And you see that tension immediately.
Yeah.
Right inside the Labour cabinet. You had the Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, pushing for economy, austerity. He even suggested pulling troops out of Germany.
Yeah, cutting back.
But then the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, backed fully by Prime Minister Attlee, was absolutely determined. Determined for Britain to keep playing a world role.
Yeah.
He even went as far as pushing for Britain to get its own nuclear weapons.
Right. And Bevin, he was juggling some incredibly complex problems, yet the whole settlement of Germany, Indian demands for independence heating up, the violence between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, plus Britain's role in the emerging Cold War and then the Korean War later on. He handled many of them skillfully, you have to say. Though that Arab-Israeli situation, it proved too tough. He eventually handed it over to the UN. Then the Conservatives come in 1951. Anthony Eden, first as Foreign Secretary, then PM. He really dominated foreign affairs until Suez, of course.
Suez, 1956.
Yeah, that ended in total humiliation. And it seemed to prove pretty starkly that Britain just couldn't run its own independent foreign policy anymore. Not without, getting the okay from the Americans.
And this whole shift in global power, it was happening just as another massive conflict was brewing, wasn't it? The Cold War. Our sources define it pretty clearly. That period after 45, where relations between Soviet Russia and the West were just so bad, no direct fighting between the main camps, but constant hostility propaganda, economic pressure, non-cooperation.
What's really striking is how fast that wartime harmony just evaporated. The USA, the USSR, the British Empire allies during the war, but afterwards, both superpowers started gathering allies. The Soviets pulled Eastern Europe and China into their sphere. The U.S. worked with Japan, Britain, Western Europe, pumping in economic aid to build this anti-communist bloc.
And every single action by one side was seen as aggressive by the other, just constant suspicion.
Yeah, total breakdown of trust.
And the basic cause, it seems pretty fundamental. Deep differences between communist states and capitalist ones. Stalin wanted to strengthen Russian influence, especially in Eastern Europe. And the West just saw that as pure aggression.
And it's interesting, early on, U.S. and British leaders had different takes on Stalin. Churchill was suspicious right from the start.
Yeah, famously so.
He even wanted to try and race the Russians to Berlin. Roosevelt, though, he initially trusted Stalin. But Truman, his successor, he grew suspicious pretty quickly. That feeling really solidified at the Potsdam Conference. Some historians even argue Truman dropped the atomic bombs on Japan partly to send a message to Stalin to deter him.
Wow. That's a sobering thought.
It is. And Ernest Bevin, Britain's foreign secretary, he shared Churchill's anti-communist view. He believed Britain had to stand up to Russia, and the way to do that was through Anglo-American cooperation. But the Americans, initially, they were a bit reluctant to get heavily involved in Eastern Europe. They were kind of shocked when communist governments took firm hold there by late 47.
You know, it's fascinating how the historical view on who was responsible for the Cold War has changed over time.
Oh, absolutely.
Initially, Western historians mostly pointed the finger at Stalin,
Huh.
spreading communism.
Standard narrative then, yeah.
But later, Soviet historians and even some American ones started arguing Russia was acting defensively, that the U.S. actually provoked the hostility.
The revisionist take.
Exactly. And then you get the post-revisionist view in the 1980s, which is more of a middle ground, saying, well, maybe both sides share responsibility. Like American economic policies, Marshall Aid, for example, weren't just about recovery. They were also about increasing U.S. political influence.
Yeah.
And Stalin, maybe he was more of an opportunist than following some grand plan.
It's a great reminder that historical interpretation isn't fixed, is it? It evolves as we get more perspective, more evidence.
Definitely. It helps us understand the complexities.
And these different views help us see how things played out in specific moments, these Cold War flashpoints, and where Britain fitted in.
Okay, so let's look at that. Britain's direct involvement. The sources mention the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. In February 1947, Britain basically told the Americans, look, we can't afford to keep propping up Greece against communist guerrillas anymore, essentially saying, you guys have to step in.
A really stark message. And it directly led to the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. basically pledged to support free peoples resisting subjugation. Greece and Turkey got massive aid almost immediately. Then came the Marshall Plan, sort of the economic arm of the Truman Doctrine. Huge amounts of financial help offered to boost European recovery and, crucially, to stop communism spreading. And Bevan, for Britain, he jumped right on it, took the lead organizing 16 European nations to figure out how to use this aid.
And here's where it gets really interesting, the Russian reaction.
Yeah.
They saw Marshall Aid wasn't just generosity. They called it dollar imperialism, rejected the offer flat out. And crucially, they stopped their satellite states in Eastern Europe from taking part.
And that action, well, it really cemented the Iron Curtain, didn't it?
Yeah.
It deepened the Cold War divide significantly.
Absolutely. And the tension just ramps up from there. The Berlin blockade in 1948.
A major crisis. Germany and Berlin were split, remember? Stalin treated his zone like a satellite, just draining its resources. Meanwhile, the Western zones merged, started getting prosperous thanks to Marshall Aid, and began planning for a self-governing West Germany.
Which must have infuriated Stalin.
Totally. He was outraged and, frankly, embarrassed by West Berlin thriving right in the middle of communist poverty. So Russia blockaded all the roads, railways, canals, everything leading into West Berlin.
Trying to scar them out. But the West didn't back down. They launched the Berlin airlift. Incredible operation.
Truly remarkable. Flying in 2 million tons of supplies, food, fuel, everything, for over 10 months.
And Truman sent B-29 bombers, the planes that could carry atomic bombs, to British airfields. A very clear signal.
No ambiguity there. And it worked. Russia admitted defeat, lifted the blockade in May 1949.
What were the results of the blockade?
Huge results. First, it was a massive morale boost for the West. Second, relations with Russia hit rock bottom. Third, it directly spurred the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to coordinate Western defense. And of course, it meant Germany stayed divided. East and West Germany became separate states, a division that lasted decades.
NATO was set up just before the blockade ended, April 1949. And Bevan, who'd already started pushing for closer European defense with the Brussels Treaty, he saw NATO as his crowning achievement.
He really did.
It was hugely significant, wasn't it? Because it marked America completely ditching its old policy of no entangling alliances. A massive shift.
A fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy, absolutely. Then just a year later, another crisis. The Korean War, 1950 to 53.
Right. Korea had been divided after World War II, sort of for military convenience.
Yeah, along the 38th parallel.
And it became another Cold War flashpoint when North Korea invaded the South. Truman was convinced it was part of a bigger Soviet plan.
He saw Stalin's hand behind it.
So he got the UN involved. The U.S. led the intervention, but 14 other countries sent troops too, including Britain.
Britain sent the second largest force after the U.S. and suffered significant casualties, over 4,000.
But, as the historian Jeremy Black points out, committing troops there was actually quite hard to justify in terms of traditional British interests.
It was a long way away, yeah.
And it highlighted the unequal nature of the special relationship. The Americans often made the big decisions without really consulting Britain much.
That became a recurring theme. The war also really hurt Britain's economic recovery. All that increased spending on armaments forced the government to bring in prescription charges for the NHS.
Which was hugely controversial.
Massively. It even played a part in Labour losing the election in 1951. And another little example of that friction with the U.S. in 1951, America refused to let Britain join the ANZ-US Pact, that security deal with Australia and New Zealand.
Why?
Mainly because Britain had recognized communist China, which the U.S. really resented at the time.
So amidst all this global tension, Britain had to think about its own defense strategy. You mentioned the atomic bomb earlier.
Yes, Attlee and Bevan secretly gave the go-ahead. Britain tested its first atomic bomb in 1952. They felt it was absolutely vital for security. But the nuclear arms race just took off so quickly, it became incredibly fast and incredibly expensive. Far too much for Britain to really keep up independently.
They tried developing their own long-range missile, Blue Streak.
They did. But it was abandoned in 1960. Just too costly.
And this led to public movements like C&D, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Exactly. C&D pushed hard for Britain to disarm unilaterally, just give up its nuclear weapons. But no British government, Labour or Conservative, felt they could actually take that risk. Harold Macmillan, though, who became Prime Minister after Eden, he really emerged as quite an impressive international figure. He worked hard to repair and renew that special relationship with the U.S. He even went to Moscow, built a relationship with Khrushchev, tried to ease tensions.
There was that summit planned in 1960.
Yes, but it collapsed because of the U-2 spy plane incident, an American spy plane shot down over Russia. Despite that setback, Macmillan's diplomacy was important. By 1963, Britain managed to secure American Polaris nuclear missiles for its submarines. But even with those, it was becoming painfully clear that Britain wasn't a top-tier world power anymore, not in the way it had been.
Which brings us, I think, inevitably to the Suez Crisis in 1956, often seen as the moment this reality hit home.
It's certainly a pivotal event, a real toxic mix. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the rise of Arab nationalism under Egypt's leader, Colonel Nasser, and Britain and France desperately trying to hang on to their influence in the region, all playing out against that Cold War backdrop.
Nasser, he was pushing hard for Arab unity.
Very aggressively. And he deliberately provoked the West, recognized communist China, signed an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, part of the Soviet bloc. Then the Americans pulled the plug on funding for the Aswan Dam, a massive, vital project for Egypt.
And Nasser retaliated.
He nationalized the Suez Canal, which was, a vital waterway for Britain. 2/3 of its oil supplies came through there.
Prime Minister Anthony Eden was apparently absolutely furious, convinced Nasser was basically another Hitler who couldn't be appeased.
Yeah, that comparison was made explicitly. And he had support initially, even from Churchill, and surprisingly, from the Labour leader, Hugh Gaitskell.
Really? Gaitskell agreed Nasser shouldn't be appeased.
He did initially. It's interesting how many people seem to just overlook Nasser's offer to compensate the canal shareholders. The focus was all on Nasser himself.
The sources talk about a secret plan.
A secret Anglo-French-Israeli plan, yes. Quite shocking, really. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai. Then Britain and France would issue an ultimatum telling both sides to withdraw from the canal zone, knowing full well Egypt couldn't possibly agree to that.
Providing the pretext.
Exactly. A pretext for Britain and France to then occupy the canal zone themselves, ostensibly to separate the combatants, but really hoping it would lead to Nasser being overthrown. Anthony Nutting, a Foreign Office minister, resigned over it. Said he couldn't be party to the deception.
And recent research suggests it might have all been avoidable.
There's evidence Eden initially wanted a peaceful solution. And the U.S., especially President Eisenhower, who was facing re-election, definitely did not want military action.
So what changed Eden's mind?
Immense pressure, it seems, from MI6, from key figures in his own cabinet like Harold Macmillan. According to one source, Macmillan apparently misled Eden about the likely American reaction.
Saying Eisenhower would basically look the other way. Lie doggo.
That's the quote, yes. I know Ike, he'll lie doggo. Plus, strong pressure from the French, who were also determined to act against Nasser. It seems that combination tipped the balance for Eden.
So the invasion goes ahead. Militarily, it's quick success.
Militarily, yes, the forces achieved their objectives quickly, but diplomatically, a complete and utter disaster.
Global outcry.
Massive outcry. And crucially, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, for once finding themselves on the same side, condemned Britain and France at the UN. They demanded a ceasefire. The U.S. even threatened financial sanctions, specifically blocking access to IMF loans and refusing to support the pound sterling.
Which forced their hand.
Completely. Britain, France, and Israel had no choice but to withdraw in humiliation.
The consequences for Britain were devastating, weren't they?
Absolutely. They failed completely to get rid of Nasser. In fact, his prestige in the Arab world soared. The U.S. action against the pound caused a serious financial crisis, a run on reserves. The Anglo-American alliance, the special relationship, was badly damaged, at least temporarily. And some argue the whole crisis distracted the West and allowed the Soviets to brutally crush the Hungarian uprising happening at the same time.
So was Suez the final proof? The moment Britain's decline became undeniable.
Many people thought so at the time, and they often blamed the Americans for pulling the rug out from under them. The French were particularly angry with Britain for backing down. De Gaulle's later veto of Britain joining the EEC is often linked back to this feeling of betrayal over Suez.
But some historians offer a different view. Play down the long-term damage.
Yes, some point out that Nasser was still militarily defeated even if politically strengthened, that Britain maintained influence elsewhere in the Middle East, and that the breach with the U.S. was actually healed quite quickly under Macmillan. Dominic Sandbrook even argues Suez wasn't so much about decline, but maybe a watershed moment leading into a new era of domestic economic prosperity in the late 50s.
Interesting perspective. But for Eden personally, it was the end.
A total disaster for him, criticized for the lack of moral justification for lying to Parliament about the collusion with Israel. He was exhausted, his health broke, and he resigned shortly after.
And the irony, as you mentioned, is Macmillan, who arguably pushed for the intervention and misled Eden about the U.S., he becomes prime minister and avoids most of the blame.
Quite the political maneuver. Some historians even float the idea that Eisenhower might have secretly wanted Nasser gone for his own political reasons, despite his public condemnation. It's complex.
Okay, while all this is happening on the world stage, another possible path for Britain is emerging closer to home, Europe.
Yes, after the war, there was a strong feeling in Western Europe that they needed to unite somehow, to recover economically, stand up to the superpowers militarily, and crucially, prevent another devastating war between neighbors like France and Germany.
Churchill himself talked about a United States of Europe.
He did in a famous speech. Early steps included things like the OEEC for handling martial aid, NATO for defense, and the Council of Europe for political cooperation. But Britain was always a bit hesitant, wasn't it? Especially with the Council of Europe, they refused to join anything that seemed like it might threaten their national sovereignty.
Setting a pattern for the future, perhaps.
You could say that. It certainly foreshadowed the complicated relationship with the EEC.
The European Economic Community, the Common Market, set up by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. 6 founding members: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. But Britain didn't join.
No. And they'd already stayed out of earlier initiatives, too, like the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, back in 1951.
Why stay out of the ECS, though?
Because it involved pooling control of their coal and steel industries under a supranational authority, an independent body above national governments. Britain, which was nationalizing those industries at the time, wasn't prepared to do that.
Was that a mistake, looking back?
Many see it that way now. But at the time, the economic logic wasn't as clear. Those 6 countries were actually weaker economically than Britain then. Adel was apparently sympathetic to the idea, but wouldn't commit. And when the EEC itself was formed in 57, its aims were much broader than just trade. The Treaty of Rome spoke of creating an ever closer union. It turned out to be a huge success. The EEC became the world's biggest exporter within just 5 years.
So why did Britain stay out then? What were the main reasons?
Well, the big one was losing control over their economy to the European Commission in Brussels. That loss of sovereignty was a major sticking point. There was also real concern about damaging ties with the Commonwealth. Many still saw the Commonwealth as a more important, more promising market for Britain.
And the special relationship with the U.S.
That had to be factored in too, yes. And underlying it all was this deep-seated suspicion that economic integration would inevitably lead to political union, which British politicians were just determined to avoid.
They even set up a rival trade bloc, EFTA.
Yes, the European Free Trade Association in 1959. Britain led it. It got rid of tariffs between members, but didn't involve common economic policies or that supranational element. But it wasn't nearly as successful as the EEC. And by 1961, Britain did a complete U-turn, decided they wanted in after all.
Why the sudden change of heart?
Several reasons. By 1961, the EEC's economic success was just undeniable, while Britain's own economy was kind of stagnating. EFT clearly wasn't delivering the same benefits. The Commonwealth market was looking less secure as countries gained independence. Macmillan, who was PM then, came to believe that joining the EEC wouldn't actually harm Commonwealth trade.
He thought competition would be good for British industry.
Yes, stimulate efficiency. And probably he also saw it politically a way for Britain to lead a strong European bloc aligned with the US against the Soviet Union, find a new role that way.
So Edward Heath negotiated the terms of entry, but then de Gaulle said no.
Bang! The
Yeah.
veto. In 1963, a real shock. De Gaulle publicly said Britain had too many economic problems and wasn't European enough. He objected to the special terms Britain wanted for the Commonwealth, and he was deeply suspicious of Britain's close ties to the American connection. He feared Britain joining would just turn the EEC into an Atlantic grouping under American dependence.
Still angry about Suez, too, perhaps. And the Polaris missile deal Britain did with the U.S.
Very likely factors, yes. De Gaulle felt Britain had chosen the U.S. over Europe.
You know, the sources suggest de Gaulle's suspicions about Britain's motives might have been quite close to the truth.
How so?
Well, historians like Alan Skate and Chris Cook argue Macmillan's main reason was political, for Britain to find a new leading role on the world stage, organizing Europe as part of a wider Atlantic partnership with the U.S., not just about economics.
Interesting. French agriculture was also a big issue, wasn't it? The EEC heavily protected French farmers. Letting Britain in with its Commonwealth ties threatened that system.
So Britain was kept out. Until when?
Until 1973. After de Gaulle had resigned, then Britain finally joined, along with Ireland and Denmark. But public opinion, as we know, remained pretty divided. There was that referendum in 1975 just to confirm membership, and even then, less than half the electorate actually voted to stay in.
So Britain gets in. What happens next? New challenges within the EC, as it was then called.
Definitely. There was the Lowe Convention in 1975, which gave former colonies duty-free access, partly to counter criticism that the EC was just an inward-looking, rich club. Then in 1979, direct elections to the European Parliament started, an attempt to make the whole thing feel less remote, more democratic.
Did it work?
Well, turnout in Britain for those elections was always pretty low, often less than a third, so maybe not as much as hoped.
And then came the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism.
Yeah.
That caused problems for Britain, didn't it?
Big problems. It was set up in 1979 to link currencies, control inflation, maybe pave the way for a single currency eventually. Britain stayed out initially. Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor, wanted to join, but Thatcher wouldn't let him.
But they did eventually join.
Yes, in 1990, under John Major. But the economy was weaker then. The pound went in at too high a rate. It became unsustainable. Britain was forced out September 1992, Black Wednesday. A huge political humiliation for Major's government.
Meanwhile, the EC kept growing.
Yes, Greece joined, then Spain and Portugal. Poorer countries, which increased the pressure for regional aid within the community and shifted the budget dynamics.
Ah, the budget. That caused a famous row, didn't it, with Thatcher?
The British budget contribution. In 1980, Thatcher realized Britain was paying in far more than it was getting back, partly because it imported more from outside the EC than others. She went in demanding our money back. Through what the source calls ruthless bargaining, she did get a significant rebate, earned her the nickname Lady de Gaulle in some European capitals.
Then, in 1986, the Single European Act, aiming for a truly free internal market by 1992.
Exactly, removing remaining barriers. It also meant more EC control over things like environmental policy and more power for the European Parliament. Crucially, it introduced more majority voting in the Council of Ministers, meaning individual countries couldn't veto everything.
Which stirred up sovereignty concerns again, especially in Britain and Denmark.
Big time. Thatcher was particularly vocal against any move towards what she saw as a centralized federal superstate.
And we can't talk about the EC without mentioning the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy.
Ah, the CAP, infamous. Those subsidies paid to farmers led to absolutely massive overproduction, the butter mountains and wine lakes. By 1987, there were supposedly 1.5 million tons of surplus butter.
Incredible waste. And a huge drain on the budget.
A massive drain. Reforms were eventually brought in quotas, set-aside schemes, but even by the late 90s, CAP was still eating up almost half the entire community budget. Further reforms were always being debated.
Then came Maastricht in 1991, creating the European Union, the EU.
Right. The Maastricht Treaty aimed for even closer union, including setting the stage for a single currency, the euro, and developing common foreign and security policies.
But Britain objected.
Strongly, especially to the idea of a federal Europe and locking in a monetary union. John Major secured opt-outs for Britain on both the single currency and the social chapter.
The social chapter.
That dealt with workers' rights, social protections. Britain objected, arguing it would raise business costs and make them uncompetitive. So it was initially kept out of the main treaty for everyone, largely due to British pressure. Though Tony Blair signed Britain up to it later when Labour came to power.
Was Maastricht popular across Europe?
Not universally, no. There was a lot of public skepticism. Denmark actually voted no in a first referendum. France only approved it by a tiny margin. Referendums in Switzerland and Norway rejected related proposals. In Britain, Major's government didn't dare hold a referendum. They pushed it through Parliament, but only just. It caused huge divisions in the Conservative Party, with Eurosceptics constantly challenging Major over it.
So Blair comes in, 1997, a more Euro-friendly approach.
That was the signal, yes. Rejoining the social chapter was part of that. But significantly, Britain still stayed out of the euro when it launched, even as France, Germany, and others went ahead. And the EU faced new challenges too, like planning for enlargement to include much poorer countries from Eastern Europe. That raised big questions about budget contributions, structural funds, and how the whole thing would work with so many more members.
Right. So, after all this, has Britain found a role? It brings us back to that famous quote from Dean Acheson in 1962. Britain has lost an empire, but has not yet found a role.
It really struck a nerve, didn't it? Acheson seemed to be implying Britain's greatness was all tied up with the empire, and without it, what was left?
George L. Bernstein's argument, according to the sources, is quite stark. He says British leaders in 1945 just completely misread the situation. They aimed for this impossible goal, a level of world power Britain had never actually held before, even with the empire.
So for Bernstein, things like the end of empire, Suez, losing nuclear independence, they weren't signs of some new weakness or decline. They were just reality catching up, a demonstration of reality that had been hidden for a while.
So Britain's first reaction was cling to the special relationship with the U.S.
Seems so, but as we've seen, that was often a very unequal partnership. Britain was definitely the junior partner.
And then, eventually, reluctantly almost, Britain turned towards Europe, the EU.
Yes, mostly driven by economics, it seems. But always with this deep reluctance to give up sovereignty. Thatcher fought against deeper integration. Even Blair, who projected a more positive image, drew the line at joining the euro.
Which leads to that question Bernstein raises. Can Britain really be that bridge between America and Europe if it's not fully committed to Europe itself?
A really pertinent question. Bernstein's conclusion seems to be no. Britain could only be that kind of link if it was fully integrated and trusted within Europe.
But then Andrew Roberts offers a totally different take.
He does. A much more positive spin, you could say. Roberts argues Britain actually managed quite successfully to balance its commitments across what he calls its three directions.
The special relationship, the EU, and the Commonwealth.
Exactly. Along with its key roles in NATO, the G7 group of industrialized nations, trade organizations like GATT, and the UN Security Council.
So Roberts thinks Britain wasn't played out at all.
Quite the opposite. He suggests that around the early 2000s, Britain was actually in a stronger international position than it had been for decades, maybe since Suez, in the EU, but not the euro, close to the US, still a nuclear power with that UN veto, a leading Commonwealth member, fifth biggest economy in the world. It challenges that whole narrative of inevitable decline.
Which ties into Bernstein's later book title, doesn't it? The Myth of Decline.
Precisely. He argues that even if there was some relative economic decline or less global clout militarily, you have to weigh that against the huge social and cultural changes within Britain. Advances in science, culture, finance, the transformation into a more diverse society. Bernstein suggests this represents a kind of progress that maybe outweighs the perceived decline in global status.
Andrew Marr paints a similar picture, doesn't he? Describing modern Britain as, post-industrial and multi-ethnic island, crowded, inventive, and rich.
Yeah, with enduring democracy, a generous welfare state, the NHS, it puts the whole decline debate in a much broader context. Helps you understand why, despite all the challenges we've discussed, Britain remained, and remains, an attractive place for many. It's just not a simple story.
Well, this deep dive into Norman Lowe's work has certainly highlighted the sheer complexity of Britain's post-war journey. From losing the empire and navigating the Cold War to those hesitant steps into Europe and the shock of Suez. It really is a story of a nation constantly having to redefine itself.
Absolutely. We've seen how those internal debates, the pressures from outside, and that persistent desire to maintain influence, how they all shaped the crucial decisions made along the way. And that ongoing argument among historians, Was it decline, or was Britain just finding a new kind of greatness? It's such a powerful reminder that history is rarely straightforward. There isn't one simple answer.
Ultimately, I think this shows us that national identity isn't fixed, is it?
Yeah.
Britain's path involved pragmatic adjustments, sometimes painful ones, but also these moments of really deep self-reflection. And that's led to the complex, multifaceted role it plays in the world today.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about. How do these historical narratives, these perceptions of national decline or rise, actually influence a country's choices and its sense of identity, even right now in the present day?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.